Imagine a job so glamorous, so cutting edge, that it literally made you glow in the dark. Picture this. It's the 1920s, a time of flapper dresses, jazz music, and breathtaking scientific discovery. And for a select group of young women in America, a new job opportunity seemed like a dream come true. They were paid 3 times the average salary. They worked with a magical, glowing substance, and they became local celebrities known as the Ghost Girls. They painted their nails with it, dusted it in their hair, and wore their finest dresses to work so they would shimmer and glow on the dance floor at night. The substance was radium, the miracle element of the new century, and they were told it was perfectly safe. In fact, they were told it might even be good for them. They were lied to. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the horrifying, true story of the Radium Girls, whose dream job became a waking nightmare, and whose fight for justice changed the world forever. Their bodies became toxic laboratories, their bones literally crumbling from the inside out. They were poisoned by their employer, disbelieved by doctors, and discredited by corporate lawyers. But their story is not just one of tragedy. It's a story of incredible courage, a battle against a corporate giant that left a legacy of worker protections we all benefit from today. They glowed in the dark, but their real legacy was shining a light into the darkest corners of industrial greed. To understand how this nightmare began, we have to go back to the discovery of radium itself. In 1898, the brilliant Marie Curie and her husband Pierre isolated a new element from uranium ore. It was unlike anything seen before. It spontaneously emitted energy, it could burn skin, and most captivatingly, it glowed with a faint, ethereal blue-green light. They named it radium. In an age without widespread electricity, this self-luminous power seemed like pure magic. The world went wild for it. Radium wasn't just a scientific curiosity. It was marketed as a cure-all, a veritable fountain of youth. Entrepreneurs, quacks, and even some legitimate companies began infusing everyday products with this wondrous new element. You could buy radium-laced water, radium butter, radium milk, and even radium chocolate. There were radium cosmetics that promised to give your skin a youthful glow, and radium toothpaste to brighten your smile. There was even a device called the radiandocrinator, a small case containing radium that men were instructed to place in their underwear at night to enhance their virility. People saw radium not as a poison, but as a health tonic. It was the energy source of the future, a symbol of modernity and progress. It was in this atmosphere of radium mania that the United States Radium Corporation opened its factory in Orange, New Jersey, in 1917. The world was at war, and one of the most crucial pieces of military equipment was the watch. Soldiers in the dark trenches needed to be able to tell the time to coordinate attacks, and radium provided the solution. The company developed a special paint called undark'a, a mixture of radium salts and zinc sulfide. When painted onto watch dials and instrument panels, the numbers and hands would glow brightly, 24 hours a day, without any need for a power source. The demand was enormous, and the U.S. Radium Corporation needed a workforce with a very specific skill set. Small, nimble hands for the delicate work of painting tiny numbers. They found their perfect employees in the young women of the community, many of them teenagers, some as young as 14. For these girls, many from working-class immigrant families, this was the job of a lifetime. The work was clean, the studio was bright and filled with the chatter of friends, and the pay was phenomenal. Dial painters could earn more than $10 a week, a fortune compared to the $2 or $3 they might make in a sweatshop or as a domestic servant. It was skilled, artistic work that gave them financial independence and a sense of pride. They were part of the modern world, working with the miracle element of the age. The company, of course, assured them that the glowing paint was completely harmless. The technique they were taught was simple, yet deadly. The brushes they used were made of fine camel hair, but after a few strokes, the bristles would lose their shape. To create a razor-fine point for painting the tiny numbers, the supervisors taught the girls a 3-step process: lip, dip, paint. They were to put the brush between their lips to shape it into a point, dip it into the radium paint, and then paint the dial. Lip, dip, paint. Over and over, hundreds of times a day. With every dial they completed, They were swallowing a small dose of one of the most radioactive substances known to man. When some of the girls expressed concern about putting the paint in their mouths, they were told not to worry. The chemists who handled the raw radium powder wore lead aprons and used ivory-tipped tongs, but the girls were told that the tiny amount in the paint was too small to cause any harm. It was a lie. The owners and scientists at US Radium knew about the potential dangers of radium. They had seen the research from Europe and they took precautions for themselves. But for the girls on the factory floor, they maintained the fiction of safety. It was cheaper that way. The girls had no reason to doubt them. In fact, they embraced the magical dust. The radium was everywhere in the studio. It settled on their hair, their clothes, their skin. When they walked home at night, they would softly glow, earning them the nickname the Ghost Girls. They thought it was a marvelous perk of the job. They would deliberately wear their best dresses to work, knowing the dust would settle on the fabric and make them shimmer when they went out dancing after their shift. They painted their fingernails with the glowing paint for fun. Some even painted their teeth to give their dates a glowing, ghoulish surprise when they smiled in the dark. They were young, full of life, and completely unaware that the very thing that made them sparkle was meticulously and silently destroying them from the inside. The dream job was about to reveal its true nature. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came from a young woman named Molly Maggia. In 1922, she had to quit her job at the radium factory because of a toothache. Her dentist pulled the tooth, but the socket didn't heal. It just bled and filled with pus. Then the next tooth started to hurt and it too was pulled. Soon, her entire mouth was a source of agonizing pain. Ulcers bloomed on her gums and her breath took on a foul, putrid odor. The infection spread and her dentist, trying to get to the root of the problem, gently probed her jawbone. To his horror, a piece of it simply broke away in his forceps. It had rotted. The doctors were baffled. They diagnosed her with syphilis, a common catch-all diagnosis at the time for unexplainable illnesses, especially in young women. But Molly's condition worsened with terrifying speed. The infection spread down to her throat and into the bones of her skull. Within a year of her first toothache, Molly Maggia was dead. Her official cause of death was listed as syphilis. But soon, Molly wasn't the only one. Other dial painters started experiencing the same horrific symptoms. Grace Fryer, another of the original painters, developed problems with her jaw and excruciating pain in her feet. Another girl's leg bones suddenly snapped while she was dancing. Others developed severe anemia, their bodies unable to produce healthy blood. Their bones became so brittle they would fracture under the slightest pressure. The most terrifying and common ailment was what became known as radium jaw. Just like with Molly, their jawbones would become honeycombed with holes, glowing with a sickly phosphorescence in X-rays before completely disintegrating. The pain was described as constant and unbearable. The US Radium Corporation knew what was happening. They had started commissioning their own secret studies as early as 1924. One report, conducted by a Harvard physiologist, confirmed that the paint was dangerously radioactive and that the girls were being exposed to lethal doses. The company's response was not to warn the workers or improve safety. Instead, they buried the report. Publicly, they launched a campaign of denial and disinformation. They insisted that radium was safe and that the girls' illnesses were unrelated to their work. They paid doctors and dentists to misdiagnose the victims, and they actively worked to discredit the women who spoke out. When a local pathologist, Dr. Harrison Martland, began to correctly diagnose the condition as radium poisoning, the company tried to sue him for libel. They claimed the girls were trying to cheat the company out of money. They used their power and influence to silence the truth, hoping the problem and the girls themselves would simply die and disappear. But they underestimated the women they had poisoned. One of them, Grace Fryer, refused to be silenced. By 1925, she was in constant pain. Her spine required a steel-back brace, and she could no longer work. She knew her illness was connected to the factory, and she was determined to hold the company accountable. But her search for justice seemed hopeless. She approached dozens of lawyers, but none would take her case. The U.S. Radium Corporation was a powerful and wealthy opponent. Furthermore, the statute of limitations for workplace injuries was only 2 years, and for most of the girls, that time had already passed. They were caught in a legal trap. Their disease took more than 2 years to manifest, making it legally impossible to sue. For 2 long years, Grace searched, her health failing with each passing day. Finally, in 1927, a young, ambitious lawyer named Raymond Barry agreed to take the case. He found 4 other women willing to join Grace in her lawsuit: Edna Hussman, Quinta McDonald, Albina Laris, and Catherine Shaw. Together, they became known as the Radium Girls. Their legal battle would capture the nation's attention and expose the dark truth of the miracle element. While the legal battle raged, science was beginning to catch up and explain the horrific mechanism of their poisoning. Dr. Harrison Martland, the pathologist the company had tried to silence, was at the forefront of this research. He, along with other scientists, discovered the insidious way radium attacked the body. Chemically, radium behaves very much like calcium. When the girls ingested the paint, their bodies mistook the radium for calcium and deposited it directly into their bones. Once it was embedded in their skeletons, it was there to stay. And this is where the true horror begins. Radium is an alpha emitter. It constantly releases tiny, high-energy particles. Unlike gamma rays, which can pass through the body, alpha particles are heavy and slow. They can be stopped by a simple piece of paper or the outer layer of your skin. But inside the body, they are devastatingly destructive. From within the women's own bones, the radium was firing a relentless barrage of these alpha particles into the surrounding cells. It was like swallowing millions of microscopic machine guns that never stopped firing. This internal radiation was shredding their bone marrow, preventing the creation of new blood cells and causing severe anemia. It was punching holes in their bone tissue, making their skeletons as fragile as moth wings. It was mutating their DNA, leading to aggressive and deadly bone cancers, known as sarcomas. Their own bodies had been turned against them. Their skeletons had become radioactive tombs. To prove this theory, Dr. Martland needed definitive evidence. He asked to exhume the body of Molly Maggia, the first girl to die. When her coffin was opened 5 years after her death, her remains were still so intensely radioactive that they caused a photographic plate to glow in the dark. The proof was undeniable. The company's lies were exposed. The story of the Radium Girls became a media sensation. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the living dead women fighting for their day in court. The public was captivated and horrified. The image of these young women, some now too weak to walk, being carried into the courtroom, was a powerful indictment of corporate greed. The company, however, continued to fight. Their lawyers used every delay tactic they could think of, hoping the women would die before a verdict could be reached. And they almost succeeded. By the time the case finally went to court in 1928, none of the 5 women could raise their arms to take the oath. Grace Fryer was in a steel brace, and 2 of her co-plaintiffs were bedridden. They testified from their deathbeds, their voices weak but their resolve unshaken. Faced with mounting public pressure and the damning scientific evidence, the U.S. Radium Corporation finally offered to settle. The terms were meager. Each woman would receive $10,000 and a $600 a year annuity for as long as they lived. All of their medical bills would also be paid by the company. The women accepted. They knew they were dying and that this was likely the only justice they would ever see. None of them lived for more than a few years after the settlement. Their victory was bittersweet, but their story was far from over. While the drama in New Jersey was unfolding, a second, parallel tragedy was taking place in Ottawa, Illinois. Another company, the Radium Dial Company, had also been employing young women to paint watch faces using the exact same lip-dip paint technique. And just like in New Jersey, the girls in Illinois started to get sick and die. One of these women was Catherine Wolfe, who would later be known by her married name, Catherine Donahue. She began working at Radium Dial in 1922 at the age of 19. A decade later, she was dying, riddled with tumors and her jawbone destroyed. Inspired by the case of the New Jersey girls, Catherine and her colleagues decided to fight back. Their battle would be even more arduous. The Radium Dial Company fought even harder than U.S. Radium, denying any responsibility until the very end. The case dragged on for years. Catherine Donahue, emaciated and frail, famously testified from her deathbed, propped up on pillows in her own home because she was too sick to travel to the courthouse. In 1938, after numerous appeals by the company, the Illinois Industrial Commission finally ruled in favor of the women. It was a landmark decision. The company appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which refused to hear the case, cementing the women's victory. Catherine Donahue died less than a year later, but her fight had changed the law. The Illinois case was monumental because it established a crucial legal precedent. It affirmed that employers were responsible for the diseases that their workers contracted in the workplace. It helped establish the right of individual workers to sue their employers for damages from occupational diseases. The tragic story of the Radium Girls became a national scandal that could no longer be ignored. Their suffering and their courageous fight forced a reckoning in American industry. It led to the creation of new industrial safety standards to protect workers from radiation and other toxic substances. The dial painting industry itself was reformed, and the deadly lip-dip paint method was banned forever. The legacy of the Radium Girls extends far beyond the courtroom. Their case provided invaluable data for scientists studying the long-term effects of radiation on the human body. The measurements of radium in their bones helped establish tolerance levels for radiation exposure, which were later used by the Manhattan Project and in the development of nuclear power and medicine. Their sacrifice, unwilling as it was, helped save countless lives in the decades to come. Their story is a chilling reminder of what happens when profit is valued over human life. But it is also an inspiring testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change. They were young women who were told they were disposable. They were poisoned, lied to, and dismissed. But they refused to be silent. They fought for justice not just for themselves, but for every worker who would come after them. They glowed in the dark from the radium that was killing them, but their true and lasting legacy is the brilliant light they shone on a dark chapter of history, illuminating a path toward a safer and more just world for us all.